Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of August 29th, 2024. We are recording this week from the awards division here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House, overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest this week is Jacqueline Jones, the winner of the 2024 Pulitzer Prize in History. Jackie Jones is Professor Emerita at the University of Texas at Austin, where she held the Ellen C. Temple Chair in Women's History and the Maston Gentry White Professor of Southern History. She previously taught at Wellesley College, Brown University, and Brandeis University. Jackie received her BA from the University of Delaware, where she was a Phi Beta Kappa, and her master's and PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Jackie is the author of 10 books, including Soldiers of Light and Love, Northern Teachers and Georgia Blacks, 1865 to 1873, published in 1980 by the University of North Carolina Press. Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women, Work, and the Family, From Slavery to the Present, published in 1985 by Basic Books, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and winner of the 1986 Bancroft Prize. Saving Savannah, The City and the Civil War, published by Alfred A. Knopf in 2008, which won the Georgia Historical Society's Malcolm Bell Jr. and Muriel Barrow Bell Award for the best book in Georgia history. A Dreadful Deceit, The Myth of Race, From the Colonial Era to Obama's America, published by Basic Books in 2013, which was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. A book entitled Goddess of Anarchy, The Life and Times of Lucy Parsons, American Radical, published in 2017 by Basic Books, and the one she is here to talk about today, entitled No Right to an Honest Living, The Struggles of Boston's Black Workers in the Civil War Era, published in 2023 by Basic Books, which won the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for History on May 6th of this year. Jackie has won numerous grants and awards across her career, including a MacArthur Fellowship. She also served as vice president for the professional division of the American Historical Association from 2011 to 2014. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and is an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. We are very pleased to have such a distinguished scholar as a guest on our podcast today. My conversation with Jackie Jones begins now. Jacqueline Jones, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much.
In the interest of full transparency to our audience, you and I have known each other for many years. You were a longtime friend of the Georgia Historical Society. You have been down to Savannah numerous times to talk to audiences here about your book, Saving Savannah. You helped us out for teacher training seminars that we did through the NEH. So we have a long history, and I'm going to call you Jackie in this podcast.
Yes, and don't forget that I came to Savannah to do research, and I came in the winter.
Yes, I do remember
which was
that. And
delightful.
And in fact, we have your research notes, I think, here as part of our research collection that for all the research you did for Saving Savannah, which is wonderful. Yeah. Which we'll talk about the research you did for your new book and where that is. But first of all, congratulations, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize in History for 2024. I know you've won prizes before. What was it like winning this one?
Well, it was a complete shock. In all honesty, I didn't know that I had been nominated or that I had made it through the first cut. The committee nominates 3 books that the jury then picks one of them. And I really didn't know that this was a possibility. So it was an afternoon in May, and my husband and I were at our daughter's house. We look after her kids when they get home from school. And my husband was playing basketball with my grandson. I like to referee those games because I call the fouls and I call the 3-pointers, but I like to referee because I get to check my phone every once in a while as well. So it was during one of these games that an email came to me from Susan Ferber, who's an editor at Oxford University Press, not my editor, but a good friend of mine. And the email just said, "Congratulations, Jackie." And I had no idea what she was talking about. Didn't know the winners were going to be announced that day. As I said, I didn't even know I was in the running. So I thought about it for a while and I was just so flummoxed that I replied to her with a question mark. And she said, Jackie, you won the Pulitzer Prize. So that was how I found out. And as I said, it really came as a shock, a really wonderful surprise, obviously, but a surprise.
Wow. So you didn't even get the news from your own publisher or editor.
No, no, I guess
Wow.
Susan had been watching the announcement on YouTube, which was being streamed at that point. So, yeah, she told me.
And so there's a ceremony, I guess. You actually go to New York at some point.
Yes, there's a dinner in October.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not like when you get into the Hall of Fame and you sit there with their phone waiting to hear they're going to call you. Nobody called you. You were refereeing a basketball game and you heard it.
No, and in fact, I didn't hear officially for another couple of weeks. And
Wow.
yeah, it was a kind of strange occurrence. So, right.
Yeah. I don't remember. I saw something, an alert on my phone that they had been announced, and so I immediately got on because I'm always interested in the ones that are related to our profession, right? Which history, biography, nonfiction, the usual,
Right.
and to see, and so I was delighted and immediately sent you an email, and you responded, which was so nice and so gracious. So, has it changed your life at all?
Well, not really. We still plan to meet the kids after school when they get home on the bus every afternoon. I'm working on another project at this point. I'm happy to give presentations. I've, been interviewed by a number of podcasts. I've given live presentations. So, I love to talk about the book, but yeah, so it's been great.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about the book. I mentioned, and there's an introduction to this podcast that people will hear and they'll hear the titles of your previous books. Um, so the first question I have is, and there among many, is why Boston? You had done Savannah, and I know you've done a lot of work through the years in this period of both Civil War and Reconstruction. But why Boston? Why not Philadelphia, New York, or any place else?
Well, I knew I was going to be moving back to the Boston area after I retired. That's where my two daughters live and their families. But I was also struck by the recent literature on the North and the antebellum period and a number of wonderful books on the civil rights struggle in the antebellum period. And these are wonderful and compelling works of history that deal with Boston and New England in general and show the barriers that Black people faced in that part of the country. Most of our emphasis is on the South when we look at Black history in the antebellum period. But I was struck going over these books. First of all, I should say that Massachusetts seemed to be particularly enlightened. By 1860, Black men could vote. Actually, they could vote as a result of the 1780 Constitution of Massachusetts. Black men were serving on juries by that time. Blacks and whites could intermarry in Massachusetts. The Boston public schools had been desegregated by that time. In other words, Boston, by certain measures, seemed particularly enlightened, even compared to other northern cities in this period. But what I noticed about these books was that none of them talked about the issue of work. And we know that work is a central lived experience for many people. And from the social division of labor cascades a whole number of other truths about where people can send their kids to school, where they can work, the kind of police and fire protection they get. So I was really struck by the fact that most of these other books focused on politics and legal rights in general, but ignored the issue of work. And I was just curious to see whether studying work in particular would modify or challenge or confirm what these other books told us about New England during this period.
The one word that leaps out of your book, and this is not original to me, after reading all 444 pages of this book and the notes too, is hypocrisy. Because you're right, you think, I think it's sort of ingrained into our historical consciousness that in the antebellum period before the Civil War, places like Boston were enlightened somehow more than other places, because, as you say, they black people could vote, could intermarry, whatever it was. But you sort of peel all that away, and I will tell you that in conjunction with David Blight's book on Yale and slavery, which I talked to him about back in the spring, one comes away at the end of all this by about 1915 feeling as if perhaps nothing at all, that the Civil War really changed nothing. I'm not sure that was what you were after, but dive into that a little bit about the whole idea that you sort of ripped the Band-Aid off with the idea that Boston was a better place for black people than, say, Richmond. How could that not be true? Tell our audience sort of in a nutshell
Well,
how that's not true.
again, we have to think about work. And
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
do note that between 1840 and 1900, just think of all the dramatic things that happened: the Industrial Revolution in New England, the Civil War that claimed over 700,000 lives, the beginning of a second industrial revolution in the second half of the 19th century, the emergence of the retail and clerical sectors. All of these are dramatic events that very much affect patterns of work in New England. And yet, the division of labor when it came to people of color in Boston was the same in 1900 as it had been in 1840. Nothing had changed, nothing of substance, really. So that's quite striking. And there are a couple of other points I wanted to mention. Obviously, I begin the book by quoting John S. Rock, who was a really remarkable person. He was trained as a dentist and then a physician. He was a public lecturer. He ended his career as an attorney. He was the first Black man to be admitted to argue before the US Supreme Court. But I begin with a quote by him in 1860, where he takes to tasks abolitionists in the city of Boston. He said, you know, they're very focused on the plight of the slave in the South. And he didn't want to minimize that commitment because it often came at great personal risk. We know that William Lloyd Garrison was attacked in the city of Boston. We know that other abolitionists, white, black, male, female, were denigrated and harassed during this period. However, what is striking is that these whites, men and women, seem to care very little for their black neighbors in Boston. Their focus was on the South, the institution of slavery. I speculate that in the early 1830s, when Garrison was just finding his way, that he thought about the plight of Black people in the North and advocated a school, a training school for Black men and women that would help them get better jobs. And he soon abandoned that idea. And I think he did that because he was worried, first of all, that such a proposal would diminish support in the North for his cause, especially take money away from the abolitionist cause and perhaps put it toward this proposed school. So he did abandon these proposals that he suggested early on to concentrate eventually, of course, on slavery in the South. But I do look at other groups besides white abolitionists. And one of the themes of the book is how potential allies of Black workers really showed tremendous indifference or hostility toward Black people in the workplace. So, besides the white abolitionists, some of whom, of course, were worried that wealthy Bostonians would stop giving money to the abolitionist cause, if these people like Garrison pressed for economic justice in the workplace, because many of these employers didn't want to alienate their white workers. And so backed away from that idea of integrating their workforces. But I go beyond that and talk about the Republican Party, which gave lip service to Black equality, but its white politicians never advocated for economic justice for Blacks. I look at city officials. We might have thought, since Black men were taxpayers during this period, and they did pay taxes, not because they owned their own homes, but because they owned furniture, they owned personal property within their homes. But they never were able to get public works jobs the way whites did, and especially white immigrants. I look at labor reformers, white labor reformers during this period who were quite well known nationally. Ira Stewart was very much a leader in the 8-hour workday movement. He was based in Boston, but many of these white labor reformers were very focused on factory workers. And many Black workers were engaged in menial work, the women as laundresses, the men as servants, gardeners, porters, tenders meaning kind of messengers, errand people, all around custodians. And then I also look at a couple of other groups. I look at military veterans. We know that 180,000 Black men served for the Union cause in the navies and in the Army. And yet these Union veterans segregated their own post-Civil War groups and did not give Black men their due. And a final group I look at is academics and social settlement workers in the late 19th century, who really do, in a very specific way, I think, contribute to the emergence of scientific racism by suggesting that because Black people are not employed in department stores or in factories, there must be some reason why not, and that must be because they are not capable of such work, when in fact it was because employers would not hire them in such work. So this is a very long-winded response to your question about hypocrisy.
Mhm.
And even today, Boston is just coming to grips with its role in Black uh, life, discrimination against Black people, the role of Boston in the slave trade in the 18th century, the fact that many substantial fortunes in Boston were made off the slave trade and off investments in the Caribbean. So yes, there is this, narrative that somehow Boston was more enlightened than its southern counterparts, but only if you look at certain issues, such as suffrage, school integration, intermarriage, those kinds of things. If you look at work, I think the story is different.
Hmm. And some people, I'm sure, would say, let's not. I mean, let's give Boston its due for
Mhm.
being enlightened, at least in those areas. But at the same time, there's this ongoing tension throughout the book, and you've just said it so well. But I want to quote here. This is one of the Black people that you have, and I don't remember exactly who said this. It's toward the end of the book. We can go most anywhere with the white man and spend our dollar, but we cannot go anywhere with the white man and earn it, which kind of encapsulates the entire thing. That there's always this tension between the recognizing the humanity of enslaved people in the South, and even those people who might be living with you, but that's as far as it went. In fact, there was a fear, right, that abolition would bring all the hordes of these freed Black people to Boston and take white jobs.
Yes, that was a big issue in the antebellum period. The idea was that somehow the Civil War was going to unleash this migration, and especially Irish immigrants who were just barely eking by were going to be displaced by many Black workers who would work for lower wages. That obviously did not come to pass because the vast majority of formerly enslaved people wanted to remain near the lands of their ancestors, wanted to continue to build communities in the South. And Boston never really had that kind of mass migration that Chicago and Detroit had after World War One, for example. But I do talk about migration, a couple other kinds of migration from the South. One is the um, fugitive slaves, freedom seekers from the South who came to Boston, and one particularly dramatic incidents surrounded Thomas Sims, who escaped from Savannah in 1851, came to the city, and then underwent a legal rendition when he was returned to the South, not to I guess he was returned to his owner, James Potter, who then sold him. But his brother, James Sims, who was very well known in Savannah at the time, came to Boston during the Civil War. By that time, James and Thomas's sister had moved to Boston. And this was all done, of course, by ship. And I do talk in the book about how these fugitives made their way north. They usually had to have some money, and both James and Thomas were skilled workers, one a blacksmith, one a carpenter. I'm sorry, one a bricklayer and one a carpenter, and they were managed to earn some money. And you had to have money to bribe the crew, to bribe the captain of the ship, to make your way, to pay for lodging once you got to Boston. So, but that's one migration, and that involved hundreds and hundreds of people. It's hard to know how many. Another kind of migration happened right after the Civil War, and that was when Black refugees in the Virginia Tidewater, especially women and children, moved to Boston because of the great demand for domestic servants in that city. White women were leaving domestic service. They were going to work in factories so they could make some wages and at least have set hours, even if those hours were very long. And the idea was that somehow Black women from the South would take their places. So there are these various kinds of migrations, clandestine, gender specific as well, that are really ways that bound Savannah and Boston together, I think.
So many avenues to go here. It's worth saying that all of these people that you're talking about and who took part in what you call in one section the fugitive economy, these people came and they worked at the most menial jobs because literally that was all they had. Street sweepers, chimney sweeps, people doing back-breaking manual labor, domestic servants, cleaning out chamber pots, all these things that white people probably wouldn't do. Um, and yet, for a historian, these have always been the hardest people to uncover. And you not only uncover them, but you give us um, staggering detail about their lives. So I want you to talk for a little bit here about how you did this, because you don't just go to the archive and say, give me everything you have on all the unnamed Black people who worked here in the 19th century. You uncovered stuff here that has never really been uncovered, or at least not to this degree, I think. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, a couple of things. One is sheer luck. So my one of my favorite workers was a rat catcher who worked in the city before the Civil War. There's a great story by a Boston police commissioner who told of an officer patrolling the streets at night, coming across a Black man with a canvas or a burlap bag over his shoulder. He assumes there's something, stolen inside the bag. He asks the man to put the bag down on the sidewalk, and he notices that it's wriggling when it's placed on the sidewalk, and it has rats in it. The man has been catching rats in the city stable so that he can sell them to the rat pits, which were these venues where men would bet on how long it would take a dog to kill a certain number of rats in a pit. But the rat catcher was very proud because he said he had earned about $5 that night, which was a really good chunk of change for that period. So that stood out to me. And then I will say some of it, certainly you can find in newspapers and in the police records. But one of my favorite stories is about Joseph Clash, who owned a dance hall in Boston, and that was very popular among Black and white men and women. And one of the most vivid descriptions came from a newspaper article where the reporter gave an account of a Friday or Saturday night at the dance hall, who was dancing, what the food consisted of, what the music was. And he was accompanied by a police officer who just wanted to observe. And as it turned out, a lot of illicit activity went on in this dance hall. There were pickpockets on the periphery, there were prostitutes working there, a lot of bootleg liquor was sold. There were card sharps, there were scammers and gamblers, but it was a really popular place, so it survived for many years. So I would just say, kind of digging into the sources, keeping an eye out. One other example I'll give you again is from newspapers in 1854, an enslaved man from Richmond named Anthony Burns made his way to Boston again aboard a ship. And during his rendition hearing, where his owner claimed him and the judge eventually sent him back south, there's a very detailed description of what it must have been like for these casual laborers who had to just look everywhere every day for some kind of job. So one of the men who testified on behalf of Anthony Burns, William Jones, told about befriending this fugitive and taking him to a dancing master studio, to a hotel, to a secondhand clothing shop, at each place asking, is there work, for an hour or two? Can I sweep the floors? Can I wash the windows? But it was really an eyewitness account, a firsthand account of what casual labor was all about in Boston. So that certainly those newspaper articles, all different kinds, actually helped. And now, of course, that these databases are fully searchable, it's really opened up a whole new horizon for historians. It's a great time to be a historian. You just plug in a name, and I could follow people through the generations if they were mentioned in the paper, sometimes in police court, other times related to church activity, maybe even an obituary there at the end of their lives. So that was really wonderful.
Where did you do the bulk of your archival research?
In Boston. But
Hmm.
I will say, again, it's amazing the kinds of materials that are online these days. So, for example, I read all of the Boston City Council minutes from 1847 to 1876 or so. Those are all online. And before the war, they're handwritten. So each year is about 600 or 700 pages of handwritten material, but it's right there to use. And so many other kinds of databases, not only the newspapers. I often say if I had to be stranded on a desert island with only one website, I would pick ancestry.com because there is so much great material there. And again, you plug in names and see where it takes you. Um, so, yeah, and a lot of manuscript collections here in Boston. Again, they were not so helpful, these materials from wealthy white men and women. They're not
Hmm.
really talking that much about their workers. They're taking them for granted. But one other source I will mention is the source of the Home for Aged Colored Women in Boston that was founded right before the Civil War. And this was a home for women, most of whom had worked for domestic servants. But in order to accept them into the home, the authorities had to describe them, where they had worked, uh, what kinds of jobs they had done, where they came from originally, why they were no longer able to support themselves. Really a wealth of material, again, online there. So, yeah, I had a lot to work with.
So those records have survived, which is
Yeah,
also something of a
yeah,
miracle.
yes.
Because it's easy to think about someone coming across those on a desk or somewhere and throwing it out. But who would ever want that? Have you had? I mean, all this leads me to ask you, particularly you're talking about Ancestry.com. Have you had modern, contemporary, maybe Black Bostonians talk to you about you uncovered stuff about my ancestor. There are things in there I didn't know or I
I
learned.
haven't yet, although I was very honored to talk to a group of Black organizers, labor organizers, the spring the book came out. That was the spring of 2023. And they saw a straight line between the struggles of Black workers during this period and Black workers in Boston today. So it was rewarding for me to see my book taken seriously by people who work in the here and now and found it useful.
Have you found there is an audience of non-academics who have really been diving into this, who have been reading this?
Yes, I have. Again, on a certain level, it's local history and
Hmm. Hmm.
people who are interested in Boston, whether or not they're interested in African American history or labor history or any kind of history, actually, have picked up the book and found it very illuminating. I will say too that it provides the background for people who write on uh, uh, busing. Zebulon Vance Miletsky wrote a book on busing in Boston in the 1970s, the controversy, the violence, the violent resistance by whites, and found this book to be a kind of a prelude. Also, there have been books on exclusionary policies in the suburbs surrounding Boston and how those affected people, especially in the 20th century. Again, this book, I think, provides background or an introduction to that topic.
Hmm. And I would imagine you maybe not have heard from the Chamber of Commerce of Boston, who would say this is not the most flattering light, right, of what this popular perception of Boston is. Doesn't make us look too good. Or I'm sure there are people who say, well, that's all nice. It's history, but we solved all those problems. We don't have those problems today, right? Which is,
Well, not many people here would argue that, but I will say too that the Boston City Council has created a reparations commission to look at, especially at Boston's role in the slave trade in the
mm,
18th century. I actually wrote an op-ed for the Boston Globe and said, don't stop with the end of the 18th century and the end of the slave trade. Continue on into the 19th century to see how these patterns hardened and persisted through the generations.
mm-hmm. It was one of the most interesting things of the book. And it's not that I didn't know this, but again, it's stark relief that how dependent Boston was on the Southern slave economy and how intertwined they were. That's the first part. The second one, as literally Civil War is about to start in 1861, people in Boston really don't like the idea of a civil war, right? Of where secession is leading. This is really going to take jobs and hurt the economy, and so they begin to viciously, violently attack black people and abolitionists for sort of bringing this on. They don't blame slave owners for bringing it on. They bring these people who are right in their midst. So I guess there are two things there to talk about.
Yes, I mean, there was a tremendous mutual interdependence here between Boston and the South in particular. I mean, Boston, New England is sending south cloth, plows, um, shoes to southern plantations, and in return, it gets cotton for its textile mills. So that is a really profitable trade that benefits wealthy white men on either side of the Mason-Dixon line. And there is this horror on the part of Boston elites that somehow that trade is going to be disrupted or even destroyed. They are kind of puzzled by why Southern slave owners would want to kill this goose that's laying the big golden egg. But you're right, a lot of that anger is displaced onto abolitionists and people of color, whom they say are inciting secession, who are to blame for their heated rhetoric and their self-righteous pronouncements. But again, Boston, a very conservative city, and I make this point again. Uh, and I talked about this in the Savannah book too. On January 9th, 1865, keep in mind the war is still raging. Sherman has occupied the city of Savannah by that time. But in Boston, wealthy people get together and say, well, let's help our suffering white brethren in Savannah. They've gone through a lot. The war has been very difficult for them. The once proud, beautiful city is now dejected and weed choked and so forth. So there are a couple of mass meetings in Boston. The first is January 9th, 1865, and it's presided over by James Converse, who's the president of the Boston Board of Trade. And the owner of a vessel called the Greyhound volunteers his boat, and they send forward to Savannah at this point all sorts of food stuffs, bacon, pork lard, brown sugar, Irish potatoes, cornmeal, and beans, all this sent south for free. And this on one level, it blows your mind, right? That the war is still ongoing. Union soldiers are still being killed. And yet there is this outpouring of benevolence on the part of Bostonians towards Savannah. Well, I think the answer to that question is that in the city was stockpiled a tremendous amount of cotton that had, languished during the war. I mean, the estimates are $38 million worth of cotton. And the Boston merchants were eager to get their hands on that cotton and thought that by ingratiating themselves with the mayor and the city council, they might get some of that cotton up north. As it happened, New York City got the cotton and it was auctioned off, and Boston didn't really see it. But I think that story kind of reminds us of the importance of the economic ties here. We obviously focus on the cotton economy of the South, but as many historians have pointed out, the North was very much implicated, very much a part of sustaining that economy.
And remind me if I remember this correctly, but when some of that arrived, the white Savannahans were like, "We don't want any part of this. This is all Yankees." They reject this stuff.
Right.
Yeah,
But
but the fact that it
still,
happened, the fact that it
yeah,
happened,
yeah. I mean, these mass meetings just took me by surprise because the whole city is in mourning throughout the war. Everybody knows people who have been killed.
mhm.
And it's a devastating event, obviously, and yet how they can come together, these men, and suggest they should be sending aid to Savannah was just really, I think, indicative of these ties. And they were
Mhm.
not only economic, obviously they were cultural, they were kin ties between the two cities. Some people in the Georgia Low Country are sending their sons to Harvard. Charles Colcock Jones, the Presbyterian minister in Liberty County, sent his son, his namesake, to Harvard right before the war. So, it is interesting to look at these interconnections, I think.
And in talking about all of this, and using the word that we talked about at the beginning, the hypocrisy, it should be said too that one of the things you point out is that throughout the period from 1850 to 1875 and beyond, white Southerners were very well aware to some degree of everything you're talking about here and never failed to point out. Uh, you see what we all told you was always true. These people in the North are not your friends. To the black people, they would have said, these are not your friends. They don't care about your well-being. You're really better off here. You can go to Boston and starve, or you can come here or remain here and we'll, quote, take care of you. I mean, there's no getting around the fact, right, that this is also for a lot of white Southerners, even now, I suppose, who could read your book and say, well, they were right.
Well, but you can't underestimate
I'm not
the
saying they were
idea
right.
of a
Yeah, yeah.
political freedom, the
Hmm.
freedom to express yourself. Boston had a very militant Black community before the war, especially. And they were constantly meeting, strategizing, especially after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed in 1850, how to counter these slave catchers,
Hmm.
how to get folks who had come from the South into Canada or into the upper Midwest. The leaders were eloquent. The churches were quite active in this regard. Black abolitionists were obviously a key part of the abolitionist cause. And, I do have testimony from these fugitives about, what it's like to stop into somebody's house for tea in the late afternoon, or to go hear a concert, or maybe even participate in a glee club that's run out of one of the churches. Um, to be able to move around freely, to be able to live with one's family and not have to worry about separation. These were all compelling facts and
Hmm.
really helped drive, I think, the migration to Boston during the antebellum period, the migration of freedom seekers out of the South.
Yeah, and not have your children taken away from you and sold, of course. Absolutely. Um, who were the Edlow 66? This is one of the most fascinating things in the thread that runs through your book. So if you will, just tell that story.
Yes, so September 15th, 1847, 66 formerly enslaved people from a Tidewater, Virginia plantation called Mount Pleasant arrived in Boston. They had been freed by the will of their owner, Carter Edlow. Interestingly enough, Edlow died in 1844. So it was 3 full years before the terms of his will were recognized and respected by the executors of his estate. And it looked for a while as if they were not going to honor his will, which provided not only for the freedom of all his enslaved workers, but also that each of them should receive $50 each and should be permitted to move where they wanted to. He had a common law wife, an enslaved woman who took her money. Actually, it was quite a bit. It was, I think, in the thousands of dollars. She took the money and her children to Philadelphia, where she settled. But most of this group, and I think they numbered over 80 in total, most of the group decided they wanted to go to Boston. And partly this was because of this well-worn, watery underground railroad on ships, actually, from Virginia, from Norfolk, Fortress Monroe, Richmond, up the Atlantic coast and into Boston. And that was, as I said, a very popular route for people who wanted to flee from slavery, especially if they had enough money. But in any case, so this group arrives in 1847, and they only have $14 to their name each. They were cheated out of the 50. They have a leader, just an informal leader named Peter Randolph, who was a blacksmith on the plantation and became a minister in Boston. And one of the interesting twists in the story, I think, spoiler alert here, is that in 1855, Peter Randolph, with the help of some Bostonian lawyers, sues for the rest of that money, the difference between the $14 and the 50 that they were due. And he wins the case. It's fascinating. And that case is online. You can go online and find that case. A tremendous amount of detail there about what these men and women and children did while they were enslaved, how much they were worth by estimates. Um, Peter Randolph had to track down all of them in 1855 to see where they were and to get their permission to go forward with the suit. So it was fascinating. But one thing I did try and do in the book was to follow this group. It consisted of maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 extended kin networks who came. These were infants to elderly people. And what's interesting is that they tended to settle together. Most of them did stay in Boston, some went elsewhere. But just looking at them, uh, Thomas Selden, who was the son of Carter and Louisa Selden, uh, worked he worked for his father-in-law for a while, and then he served in the Massachusetts 55th and went south, and actually was stationed on the Sea Islands of South Carolina for much of the war after 1863. So I looked at him, I looked at his application for a pension after the war. His father, I was able to track down as well. And just to wrap this up, at the beginning when they arrived, Samuel May Jr., who was a minister working for William Lloyd Garrison for the Liberator, the newspaper, wrote that he was fascinated by this group and that they would make a great experiment to see whether they could work on their own and survive on their own, which is, obviously disingenuous. These are people who have slaved literally all their lives for white people, and now they're eager to work for themselves. But
Hmm.
May said, it'd be a great experiment because he said these are not your exceptional fugitives like Frederick Douglass, Thomas Sims, the Crafts, who, showed tremendous ingenuity and physical courage in order to flee their owners. These are ordinary plantation hands. And
Authentic, right?
let's see
Isn't
how
that the
they
word? Yeah.
fare. Right.
Yeah. I think it was it wasn't Nathaniel Hawthorne. I don't remember who it was, but somebody said these people are authentic, not like the other ones that
Yes.
you described. Like these are
Yes,
authentic
he did.
refugees.
He
Yeah.
made that comment. He saw a group of Black people in Virginia during the war,
Hmm.
and he said, "Oh, these are authentic Black people, not like the people up north."
Yeah.
And
Right.
so I
Right.
do try and deal with that idea a little bit. What
Hmm.
does race mean,
Right.
when people are making such distinctions?
Yeah. In fact, one of the things that you're right, and I'm quoting here that there was an insidious obsession with skin color that infected virtually every element of life in Boston. Yeah. So when these people get there and they're looking for opportunity, those opportunities are extremely limited, right? In terms of what they're allowed to do, no matter how educated they are, no matter how aggressive they are or entrepreneurial, their opportunities are quite limited. So I know that you're a historian and you're not a sociologist. You're not drawing a line, straight line from 1875 or 1850 to 2024. But do we see here the roots of modern wealth inequality? I mean, is this where it begins? Is it safe to say that?
Well, sure. It begins with enslavement in New England in the 17th century. And what we find when freedom comes in the late 18th century is that, as in the South, um, enslaved people are freed without really any resources to their name, no cash, no land, no credit, very little in the way of material goods, and then expected to make their way in the world. I mean, Boston, in the period I'm talking about, is a post-emancipation society, and it resembles the post-emancipation South in certain key ways. Just to bring up Peter Randolph again, he was a blacksmith in Virginia. When he got to Boston, he couldn't find a blacksmithing job. He had to work as a tender, which was basically a custodian, which he did until he could become ordained as a Baptist minister. So, what we find is that after a while, this impoverished population in Boston, after emancipation, um, finds it very difficult to get good jobs. And yet people are saying, well, their poverty is their natural condition. This is, they're going to remain poor forever. This is just who they are, not really, obviously grappling with the institutional barriers these folks faced in getting good jobs, a good education, opportunities, that sort of thing. And what we find, if we want to jump to 1900, is that the vast majority of Black people are still renting, and they do not have the assets to buy a home, to begin to build wealth that they can pass on to their children and grandchildren. And so when finally the Boston suburbs open up to Black people, and it's really not until the 1970s or 80s that these restrictive covenants are challenged and some pockets of the suburbs do become integrated. Uh, by that time, most Black Bostonians don't have enough money to move to the suburbs. And so they remain in Boston in overwhelmingly Black neighborhoods. So certainly that you mentioned, the accumulation of assets is crucial here. And the main way we accumulate assets is to own a home, and that was really out of reach for most Black people, and continues to be, considering the high prices here in the Boston area, which are
Hmm.
quite daunting.
And you say that even though the economy became industrialized, those jobs were still primarily white jobs, right?
Yes,
It was really the lowest rung of the economic ladder that was sort of preserved for
yes.
non-white people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the textile mill owners were pretty open about who they would hire. They hired men, women, immigrants, the native born. They hired adults, children, Catholics, Protestants, but they did not hire people of color.
Hmm. And you say at the end this that Boston is America writ large, right? That this is what was happening there was either going to happen or had happened or was happening everywhere in America.
Yes, well, the point there is that rhetoric is easy, as Jonas Rock said, quoting Shakespeare. Words are easy, but really making a meaningful difference, promoting economic justice in the workplace, integrating these work sites, that takes a lot of hard work. It takes political courage. Today, we can see, a tremendous backlash against enabling people who have not had advantages to get those in terms of going to college and other opportunities. So yeah, and I think there's a certain amount of self-congratulation, on the part of white Bostonians, and we see that on the part of Americans too, I think, that somehow we've overcome all these problems and we've solved them. And, after 1965 and the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65, we've leveled the playing fields, really not understanding how these injustices uh, accumulate over the generations, and how an inability to own a home really puts folks at a disadvantage.
So I'm going to ask you this question, and you don't have to answer it, and you may not have a good answer. But what do you say to people who would say to you, my goodness, you have really focused on one of the bleakest, darkest periods in our past. You've shined this light into a dark place. Who's better off for knowing this? Isn't this just indicative of what historians do now? You're tearing this down, the narrative. What is your response to people who say that? Because we hear it all the time now, right? So what would Jackie Jones say to those people?
To people who say ignorance is bliss, um, I would just say the more we know about our history, the better off we are as citizens, not only of this country, but of the world. And that knowing the hard truths about our past doesn't diminish our patriotism. And it doesn't make us too upset to go forward. I hate this term divisive concepts. I mean, all of human history consists of divisive concepts. That's what it's all about. But I just think that a patriotic narrative, so-called, of the US that wants to shield children from certain hard truths about our past, wants to whitewash the past, wants to substitute fiction for myth, that does no one a service, and actually hinders, I think, the project of national unity and pride. It's only when we can really confront the past, and all of it, not be afraid to go anywhere in that past, that we can have a full and accurate understanding of what our history is all about. So that's kind of a rambling response.
No, not at all. That is a perfect response. Thank you. So now just some fun questions like how long did it take you to research and write this book?
It was about 5 years.
Of constant labor. You were not teaching at this time. You were already
Well, I
retired,
had a
or were you?
reduced load. I was
Okay.
a chair of the department for a while,
Mm.
and then I retired in 2021. So I wasn't teaching full time during this period, but I was working on this book pretty much full time.
And where did you write it? I mean, literally, did you do you work in a home office, an office away from home? Do you write on a computer? What time of day do you work? All those good things.
So I take notes by hand on yellow sheets of paper. It's
Uh-huh.
very low tech. And then I type up drafts on a computer. I'm usually sitting at either the dining room table or the kitchen table. I don't really have a study, and I don't really want a study. I like to just be able to kind of plop down in the middle of things. Um, and yeah, what I do that I think might be unusual is that I concoct these tremendously detailed outlines before I
Mm.
write, so that when I sit down to write, I have pretty much every paragraph mapped out. I know which quotes I want to cite. I know what the sources of those quotes are. So I've never suffered from writer's block, just because all of that hard work of thinking and organizing goes into the outlines.
Hmm.
And so then when I sit down to write, and if I can write 6 pages a day, I feel pretty happy. I revise constantly over and over and over again. Um, so yeah, it works for me, but
And you write that outline out by hand?
yes,
Hmm. Hmm.
yes. And I can add things, I can shuffle things around. It's on line notebook paper again. Some of my colleagues are appalled that I don't use any of the fancy programs for footnotes or note taking, but
Hmm.
as I said, it works. So,
And is there a time of day? Do you spend a certain number of hours a day writing?
well, yeah, I got used to working from the morning till about 1 or 2 in the afternoon when the kids had to come home from daycare or
Hmm.
school.
Hmm.
So I usually start after breakfast and soon after lunch. And if I can put in a good 5 or 6 or 4 or 5 hours a day, I feel I put in a day.
Hmm. Um, Really quickly, I just wanted to mention in your acknowledgments, and I actually want to read this. You said I would like to acknowledge publisher Laura Heimert for her ongoing interest in my work and her determined efforts that I reach a wide audience for it. Um, do you find that that's unusual? Because you published with Knopf before your Savannah book, and now this is with Basic Book. So
And I
you're det.
published with Norton and with
Mm-hmm,
University
mm-hmm.
of North Carolina
Yeah,
Press.
it's
But
important for you to reach a wide audience, right?
yeah, Basic published Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow in 1985. And they also did A Dreadful Deceit in 2017. I'm sorry, 27. They also did, um, I'm getting the dates all mixed up here. Goddess of Anarchy, I guess, was 2017. And A Dreadful Deceit was 2013. Those were also Basic books. Um, yeah, Laura's great. She read Labor of Love when she was in graduate school. So she's um she's liked my work ever since, and I'm very grateful.
And she is the publisher at Basic Books
Yes.
now. Wow,
Yes.
that's terrific. Um, are you going to put this research in a repository somewhere for future generations to work on, look at, benefit
Yes, I
from?
certainly could. I have a lot of great printouts as well as my handwritten notes. And yeah, I should think about where I want to put some of that material.
Well, one critic said it was meticulous research and able storytelling, and I can absolutely verify that that's true. Jackie Jones, congratulations on the Pulitzer Prize on this book. It is a real testament to your uh, commitment to the craft of history. Congratulations, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Stan. It's been a real pleasure.
My thanks to Jackie Jones for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about her most recent book at basicbooks.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the GHS Volcano surfing team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. The captain of the GHS Italian wine tasting team is Rebecca PBR Bertina. Our GHS bouncer is Greg the Enforcer Durkin, and all guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. The director of the GHS Civil War Beer Division is Nate Brickwall Jackson Peterson. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The GHS Director of Accounts Payable is Bill Schroeder. The Off the Beaten Path stock market predictor is Luigi Board. The GHS table saw operator is Les Digits. Our Director of Employee Loyalty is Upton Leftus. Our staff layoff specialist is Harry Verderci, assisted by layoff counselor Oscar LaVista. Our insurance claims liaison is Royal Payne Diaz. Our customer care specialist is Begonia Payne Diaz. The official Off the Beaten Path cheese expert is Gordon Zola. The GHS summer wardrobe consultant is Bermuda Schwartz. Our staff director of Three Stooges Studies is Lee Iapoca. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff, and our Off the Beaten Path martini mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including now on YouTube and YouTube Music. You can find out everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Please also visit deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out dispatches from Off the Beaten Path, which are videos, my blog, and similar award-winning podcasts like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.